On November 21st, 1973, a World Cup qualifying match kicked off at the Estadio Nacional in Santiago, Chile. 18,000 people were in the stands. The referee blew his whistle. The Chilean players kicked off, passed the ball forward, dribbled toward goal, and scored into an empty net. There was no opposing goalkeeper. There were no opposing defenders. There were no opposing players at all. The other team never came. And underneath those same stands, in the dressing rooms, in the tunnels, in the spaces beneath the seats where the crowd was now cheering, people had been tortured and murdered just weeks before. This is the story of the ghost match, the most disturbing football game ever played, and the story of how FIFA looked the other way while it happened. To understand what happened on that November night, you need to understand what Chile was in 1970. On the morning of September 11, 1973, bombs ripped through La Moneda, the presidential palace in Chile. By early afternoon, Chilean military leaders had successfully completed a coup d'état which ousted the democratically elected Chilean president Salvador Allende. But before any of that, before the bombs, before the coup, before everything, Chile had something rare and precious. A democracy. A functioning, elected government, and a president named Salvador Allende who had won the 1970 election on a promise of equality, of nationalizing Chilean industries, of improving the lives of ordinary people. Allende was the first democratically elected socialist leader in Latin American history. His supporters loved him. His enemies, particularly in Washington, feared him. The CIA, under Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger, began immediately working to destabilize his government. Economic pressure. Political interference. Covert operations designed to make Chile ungovernable. For 3 years, Allende held on. Then on September 11, 1973, the Chilean military moved. Bombs fell on the presidential palace. By the end of that day, Allende was dead, officially a suicide, though the details remain disputed to this day. And General Augusto Pinochet had seized power. What came next was immediate and brutal. Thousands of people deemed undesirable by the new regime were taken to the Estadio Nacional in Santiago, tortured and killed. The Estadio Nacional was Chile's national football stadium, the place where the national team played. The place where crowds had gathered for decades to watch the beautiful game. Pinochet turned it into a concentration camp. The locker rooms served as interrogation chambers, torture rooms. The stadium itself had become a prison. To keep prisoners under control, the stadium was equipped with machine guns, christened Hitler saws due to their ability to cut people in half. Up to 7,000 political prisoners were crammed into the stadium at once. They were held in the changing rooms, the tunnels, the gangways beneath the stands. The velodrome, the cycling track beside the main stadium, became a place of execution. Musicians had their fingers broken and were then ordered to play their instruments. People were tortured in the rooms below the very pitch they had once cheered on. This continued until November 7, 1973. The World Cup qualifying match between Chile and the Soviet Union was scheduled for November 21st. 2 weeks after the last political prisoners were removed from the stadium. Here is where football re-enters the story, and where it becomes almost impossible to believe. The playoff between Chile and the Soviet Union would feature 2 matches, one in Moscow and one in Santiago. The team with the most goals in aggregate would move on to the 1974 World Cup in West Germany. The draw that produced this matchup was extraordinary in itself. 2 nations on opposite sides of the Cold War. The capitalist West against the communist East. Chile, newly fallen to a right-wing military dictatorship, against the Soviet Union. The political tension could not have been more extreme. The first leg was played in Moscow on September 26, 2 weeks after the coup, which brought a political dimension to the match. The Soviet authorities banned the entry of journalists and cameras into the stadium. It was a very tense game that was almost cancelled due to rumors of arrests of Chilean players in exchange for the release of political prisoners. Think about what that means. Rumors that Soviet authorities might arrest the Chilean players and trade them for political prisoners held in Chile. These were not just footballers traveling to a match. They were pawns in a geopolitical crisis. At Moscow airport, no Chilean authority received the team. Elias Figueroa and Carlos Caszely were detained by the immigration authorities for alleged irregularities in their passports. Carlos Caszely, Chile's greatest striker, fresh top scorer of the Copa Libertadores, was detained at the airport as a political statement. Not because of his passport. Because of who he was and what country he represented. Leonardo Valles, a supporter of Allende, recalls, "I feel like I was a harlequin used by a totalitarian system." These were players who, under Allende, had been celebrated as symbols of national pride. Now they were being used as props by the regime that had killed him. The first leg ended 0-0. Everything would be decided in Santiago. When the Soviet Union learned that the second leg would be played at the Estadio Nacional, the same stadium that had just been used as a torture and detention center, they said no. The Soviets sent a letter to FIFA explaining that, for moral considerations, Soviets cannot at this time play in the Stadium of Santiago, splashed with the blood of the Chilean patriots. That sentence. Read it again. Splashed with the blood of the Chilean patriots. This was not political posturing. This was a football federation saying, "We will not play on a pitch where people were murdered. We will not pretend this is normal. We will give up our World Cup place before we do this." The Soviets requested a neutral venue. FIFA refused. FIFA's position was simple: the stadium met the technical requirements. Hot water in the showers. Working floodlights. Correct pitch dimensions. That was enough. FIFA sent a delegation to inspect the stadium, who were given a superficial tour by the military authorities while all prisoners were kept out of sight. Prisoners were able to see the delegation through fences in the bowels of the stadium, but were unable to alert the delegation of their presence, as the soldiers had guns pointed at their heads. The delegation left without spotting any of the detained. Read that carefully. FIFA's inspectors walked through the stadium. Political prisoners were hidden from them. Soldiers stood behind those prisoners with guns pointed at their heads to ensure they stayed silent. FIFA declared the stadium fit for purpose and ordered the match to proceed. The Soviet Union refused to travel. FIFA issued an ultimatum: come to Santiago or forfeit the game. The Soviets chose to forfeit. However, the match was still organized by FIFA as normal, but without any away team present. This is the detail that is almost impossible to process. FIFA already knew the Soviet Union was not coming. The result, a walkover for Chile, had already been determined. There was no competitive purpose to playing the match. And yet FIFA required Chile to take the pitch anyway. Pinochet wanted the optics. He wanted a packed stadium, a crowd cheering, a goal being scored, images that could be broadcast around the world to show that Chile was normal. That the coup was over, that football was happening. That everything was fine. Some of the local players were Allende's supporters, such as one of the best Chilean strikers ever, Carlos Caszely. He remembered that November night as a nightmare, saying that before the match some people had even asked him to look inside the stadium for their relatives and friends who had been imprisoned. Carlos Caszely walked into that stadium knowing that people had been tortured in the rooms below his feet. Fans approached him before the match and asked him, "Please, while you are inside, look for our family members. Look in the changing rooms. Tell us if you see them." He was a footballer being asked to search a torture facility for the disappeared. On November 21, 1973, the Chilean players lined up in the stadium. They had no opponents. The Chileans kicked off, dribbled down the field, and shot into an open net. High above the stadium, the scoreboard read, Chile 1, Soviet Union 0. The Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano, one of the greatest writers in Latin American history, later called it the most disgraceful match in history. The stands were half full, the fans unenthusiastic, the players almost embarrassed to be taking part in this travesty. Chile had qualified for the 1974 World Cup. Nobody celebrated. Months later, in June 1974, Pinochet summoned the team for a send-off before they traveled to Germany. When we were all standing there, the doors open and there comes a guy with a cape, dark glasses, and a hat, said Caszely. A cold shiver went down my back from seeing this Hitler-like looking thing, with 5 guys behind him. Carlos Caszely famously refused to shake the dictator's hand. In that moment, in front of cameras, in front of the entire Chilean military apparatus, one footballer refused to shake the hand of a dictator. Knowing what that refusal could cost him, it was later revealed that Caszely's mother had been abducted and subjected to horrendous torture prior to the team's departure for West Germany. Caszely spoke of his revulsion at the brutality of the regime as his mother revealed marks on her torso where officers had stubbed cigarettes on her. He believes this attack was a warning to him as an outspoken opponent of the junta, not to criticize the military when abroad. They tortured his mother as a warning. And he still refused the handshake. At the 1974 World Cup itself, Chile performed poorly, unable to win a game and only scoring 1 goal. They were eliminated in the group stages. Carlos Caszely himself achieved infamy by becoming the first player to receive a straight red card in the World Cup finals. A team carrying the weight of everything that had happened, the coup, the stadium, the ghost match, the torture of their families, went to Germany and fell apart. It is hardly surprising. The story does not end in darkness. It ends in resistance. More than a decade later, in 1985, a farewell match was organized to celebrate Caszely's retirement as a professional soccer player. It was also held in the National Stadium. More than 80,000 people came. The same stadium. The same pitch. The place where people had been tortured and murdered. Now filled with 80,000 people who came not just to celebrate a footballer, but to show Pinochet, still in power, that they were not afraid. Not one television channel dared to broadcast Caszely's retirement match, in part because they knew that the game might turn into a protest. It did. In fact, it was one of the first mass gatherings of regime opponents, and it marked a turning point for a nation that for a decade had been cowed by the bullet and the torture chamber. Football gave them back their stadium. And their voice. 3 years after that match, in 1988, Chileans voted against a new electoral term for Pinochet. A year after that, they voted again. In a democratic presidential election, Pinochet's reign ended. Not with a coup. With a vote. On November 21, 1973, 11 Chilean players walked onto a pitch and scored into an empty net. The whole world watched. FIFA watched. And almost everyone looked away. The Soviet Union gave up their World Cup place rather than play on a pitch where people had died. FIFA called that a forfeiture. History calls it the only moral decision anyone made that entire year. The Estadio Nacional still stands in Santiago today. It is still Chile's national football stadium. They still play matches there, but inside, there is a permanent memorial to the people who were held, tortured, and killed in that building. A reminder that a stadium is just a building. What makes it sacred or shameful is what human beings choose to do inside it. Carlos Caszely refused to shake the hand of the man who tortured his mother. He walked onto a pitch for a match that meant nothing and meant everything. And 12 years later, 80,000 people filled the same stadium to tell a dictator, "We are still here." That is the darkest story in World Cup history. And the most human one. Subscribe to Footypedia. This is the dark side of the World Cup series, every story they never told you. Next episode coming soon.